Issue 2, EU kaput?
If I was on their side of the fence and was thinking intelligently about how I could hold the European Union together, I would say that, in fact, we should start again, and the next Commission President should be somebody who recognises the level of opposition to the project and actually would hand some powers back to the Member States as a means of buying off the increase in Eurosceptic votes. But they're not thinking like that. No, they're going to carry on regardless.
Nigel Farage's United Kingdom Independent Party, the UKIP, wants Great Britain out of the European Union. The UKIP was one of the big winners in last week's European parliamentary voting. Some 20 million voters in 28 member countries cast ballots across the EU in elections that France's prime minister terms a quote-unquote political earthquake. In France, the National Front bested both major parties with 26% of the vote. In England, the UKIP beat both Labour and the Conservatives with 28% of the vote. The UKIP win broke 100 years of dominance by the two major parties. In Spain, an upstart party, Nos Podemos, We Can, defeated both major parties. The Eurosceptic parties, right-wing and left-wing parties, were the clear winners in nations spread from Greece to Great Britain. When the next European Parliament is seated in Brussels, 1/3 of the representatives will be anti-establishment or anti-European Union. The losers, Europe's elites, Brussels bureaucrats, and professional politicians. Quite possibly, the election outcome is the most momentous event in European political history since the anti-monarchical Europe-wide revolution of 1848. Even the vaunted Economist magazine, that bastion of establishmentarianism, is now calling into question whether or not the European Union will be able to survive.
Question, how do you account for the surge in anti-establishment parties across Europe? David Rennie.
It's very different in a country like Britain, where what people want is much, much less Europe. And that's kind of what they've always wanted. And the guy you saw there, Nigel Farage, his big success, frankly, was making Europe all about immigration. So he's managed to make people, all the anger, the populist anger that people in lots of countries feel about immigration, that's been focused on Europe. But in other countries, people want Europe to be a kind of fortress Europe protectionism, and they blame Europe for globalization. What's absolutely clear is that an elite-level, top-down project, which has a lot of stuff that, frankly, The Economist supports in terms of economic openness, is being scapegoated and blamed by voters in a very dangerous way.
But the real problem here, if I may say, is how weak the European economy is. Everybody thought once you got together and you had this larger economic unit in which to work, okay, that things would get better. They haven't gotten better. In fact, they've gotten worse. And so that's what accounts for the decline in the support of the common market.
Partly
it has not worked as most of the people on the street expected it to work.
But economics is only part of it. What you've got here, John, is transnationalism, which was the real move in the last 20 years, I would say, has given way to nationalism and localism and even tribalism, the desire of the French to be French, the Hungarians to be Hungarians, the Scots to be Scots, the Catalans to break away from Spain. This is a move, I think it is worldwide. It's the most powerful move going. It's why Putin's got the Crimea. The Crimea said, we are Russians, and so they want to connect with Russia.
Yeah, but these are bad times, and in bad times people tend to turn to right-wing populism. I wish the left would learn how to exploit these grievances a little better.
Take a look at Greece.
There are some left-wing parties in this skepticism group as well. But you know, I still think the EU stays together because Germany is the banker, and it's chiefly a forum to funnel money from Germany to the other countries. They'd be fools to walk away. Well, I don't, but the Germans also benefit from it too because of the free
here's
trade.
One explanation of the upheaval. The economy.
Quote, this is the consequence of years of crazy austerity policies that have destroyed the lives of several million people. People became disenchanted with the European Union. Their reaction has been to turn to those leaders at a national level who are proposing a national way out of the EU's confused way of thinking, unquote. So says Paulo Raffone, founder of the CIPI Foundation Policy Think Tank.
Question. What is the root cause of Europe's economic malaise? I ask you, David.
Look, Europe is an expensive place to do business. People are paid reasonably well. People have very generous social benefits. In some countries, if you lose your job, you can have unemployment payments forever, for life. There's no cutoff. It's not like America where they run out. They last forever. And, you know, like the Rust Belt in the middle of America, you know, competition from China, competition from the East has knocked a lot of jobs for six, has taken away those old blue-collar jobs. It's the same story. But Europe's problem is people are losing faith in what Europe could offer by way as a solution to globalization. And if Europe can get it right, the hope was that Europe, instead of turning into a fortress, Europe could use all of its competitive advantages and create a kind of big single market which would allow Europe to survive as a rich, well-paid, comfortable place to live against this cheap competition. But people are losing faith in that project. That's definitely
the EU is in deep doo-doo. Can we agree on that?
I agree.
Is this the beginning of the end of the EU? We'll get that into a moment. But will Prime Minister Cameron stick with his planned referendum on Britain's EU membership, now scheduled for 2017? You didn't bring that up.
That depends on whether he wins the election before then, but certainly he will have to now. And there's a real question of whether he might have to move earlier than that, John. Look, the centrifugal forces have become dominant over the forces pulling things together in Europe.
Oh, let's
it's
have
all
a round.
coming apart.
Let's have a round robin. Let's tie this up. Is this the beginning of the end for the EU? Yes or no?
Fini.
No.
No.
I hope not.
Give me a yes or a no.
No.
I said no.
The answer is yes. Issue 3, Putin's Eurasia pivot.
From the outset of this crisis, the G7 nations have stood united, clear in our support for the Ukrainian people and their right to choose their own future, and firm in our message to President Putin that Russia's actions are completely unacceptable and totally at odds with the values of this group of democracies. That is why Russia no longer has a seat at the table here with us.
The G7, formerly the G8, composed of the U.S., Japan, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Russia, met in Brussels this week without Russian President Vladimir Putin. The G7 issued a blunt ultimatum to Putin: embrace Ukraine's newly elected government within 1 month or face further economic sanctions.
For my country.
But Putin may have moved beyond the Ukraine crisis already. Last month, Putin launched an Asian pivot when his summitry with Chinese leader Xi Jinping yielded a prodigious economic breakthrough. Get this. After 10 years of negotiations, Russia and China agreed to a 30-year natural gas contract unofficially valued at $400 billion. Russia and China will build a pipeline across the border to feed China's voracious energy appetite. The deal will make China second only to Germany as a major customer of Russian natural gas. The deal will not reduce Russian exports to the European Union, however, which flow from different oil and gas fields in western Russia. At $90 billion of two-way commerce in 2013, China is already Russia's largest trade partner.
Question: what is the strategic impact of Russian President Vladimir Putin's Eurasian pivot? I ask you, Eleanor.
Well, Putin is looking for allies, and he's looking for new markets. And he struck a deal with China. China really got a good deal. He's selling the gas much less to them than he could get in Europe. So I think it's wrong to look at Putin as the big winner here. I think he's taken on Ukraine and Crimea. They're basket cases. He's edged himself out of the world community. He's selling a finite resource. He doesn't have a diversified economy. So I don't think we have reason to be worried about Putin suddenly ruling the world because he's formed this alliance with China.
I certainly do. I think it's a great coup for Putin and
you mean
for
the
Russia.
$400 billion deal with the Chinese?
That's right, because this is going to give him another alternative in terms of what he can do with his natural resource. This is a major national resource. Where else is he going to be able to get this? They're also going to be paying, China's also going to be paying for a big part of the pipeline. That's going to be a huge asset over decades, not just over the 10-year contract that they have already signed. So it's a major plus for the Soviet economy, for the Russian economy, which is exactly what Putin needs.
But John, geostrategically, Look, the great achievement of our boss, Richard Nixon, was splitting these two rivals apart and giving us access to the Chinese and splitting Russia from China. Now, this move back together, I don't know how enduring it's going to be, but it is strategically important. And my view is, quite frankly, Russia belongs in Europe. So in this case, I commend some of the Europeans who are trying to make sure this Putin doesn't drift out there too far where all he has left is to turn to China.
But you're giving Kissinger's role when Nixon was president, right? Who had the breakthrough to China, and in a sense establish an alliance between China and the United States in some kind of fairly serious way.
That legacy endures, because if you look at the degree to which China is bound into Western supply chains and its manufacturing, Eleanor is right that Russia is a crude producer of oil and gas rather than a sophisticated kind of partner of China's. China and Russia, they do not trust each other. I used to live in China as a journalist. The Chinese do not trust the Russians. The Russians are paranoid about their large empty territory next to this highly crowded populous China. This is a hedge, as Mort says.
By the way,
a hedge for China
by the way, excuse me, French President Hollande is poised to go through with a $1.6 billion sale of offensive weapon systems this fall. Some 400 Russian sailors will arrive in France on June 22 to train to use the ships. Hollande is ignoring Obama's squawking about this sale. Obama doesn't like the sale. He doesn't want anything good to happen to Putin.
Right, that's right.
But Putin is cleaning up in China, and he's selling all of this stuff to...
But the French have a real stake in those two amphibious ships. They got a real stake in that, the French do.
Predictions, Pat.
Scotland will vote to secede from England this year.
Helena.
Scotland will not vote to succeed England this year.
Really?
We'll settle up on the money afterwards, Pat.
Well, what's Scotland going to do?
I think Scotland will very narrowly vote to stay, and if they don't, I'll wear my kilt on the set.
Okay. Is that your prediction, Scotland?
Yeah. I think Scotland will just about stay.
What was your original prediction before we get into the Scottish preoccupation?
It was less interesting than Scotland.
Okay.
If he wears his kilt on the set, I promise to do whatever it takes to get Scotland to do whatever it takes to get him off the kilt.
President Obama's plans to close Guantanamo before the end of his second term will suffer a fatal setback because of his unilateral action in releasing the Taliban prisoners without congressional consent. This weekend, President Obama and other Allied members paid tribute to the soldiers who took part in the invasion of Normandy that began the liberation of Europe 70 years ago. We on the group join in that salute to those valiant armies. Bye-bye.